The night before the American breakthrough was strangely calm, and Generalleutnant Fritz Bayerlein felt it immediately. In the humid darkness near Saint-Lô, the forests and hedgerows hummed with the low sounds of insects, not artillery. For weeks, the Americans had hammered the Panzer Lehr Division with a steady, predictable rhythm of shelling, heavy enough to irritate, never enough to break through. Bayerlein, exhausted from endless mapping sessions and reports from the front, stepped outside his command dugout to breathe and listen. Even silence felt like a warning. His adjutant approached hesitantly, noting the general's fixed stare toward the western horizon. Bayerlein muttered that the Americans were preparing something. He did not know what, but he knew it would be larger than anything Lehr had faced before. Panzer Lehr had been formed with pride and purpose, a unit built from the demonstration regiments of Germany's armored training schools. Its troops wore new uniforms, its tanks were factory fresh, its officers were instructors from armored warfare academies. It was meant to be the model division of the Third Reich, proved that German design, doctrine, and discipline could overcome any numerical disadvantage. But in Normandy, prestige meant very little. In the tight, claustrophobic bocage, tanks moved like cattle through narrow lanes. Every advance risked ambush, every defensive line could be flanked by the next field over. Panzer Lehr, the most mechanized division in France, found itself fighting yard by yard, hedge by hedge, burning precious fuel and losing precious men to hidden rifles and Allied air attacks that seemed to darken the skies each afternoon. As Bayerlein studied his situation map in the faint lantern glow, he knew he had almost no room left to maneuver. Lehr's initial strength of 93 operational tanks had already been worn down by constant engagements. Many still ran, but only after frantic repairs performed under fire. Ammunition was low, replacements non-existent. The men were tired. More than tired, they were worn thin in the way only prolonged close-quarters attrition could carve into a soldier's face. Yet their morale, at least outwardly, held. They were proud to serve in an elite formation. They trusted Bayerlein, who rarely sat at headquarters for long and frequently rode forward to see conditions for himself. Just after dawn on July 25th, a faint buzzing sound drifted overhead, distant at first, like a swarm of insects. A communications officer stepped outside and froze. The noise intensified, building into a rolling howl that washed across the landscape. Bayerlein hurried outside, instinct already tightening in his stomach. The horizon was stitched with aircraft, dozens, then hundreds, then what seemed like a moving wall of metal. They flew in staggered waves, sunlight glinting off their wings as they gathered into formation. A few German machine gunners opened fire reflexively before their officers shouted them down. The planes were too high, too many, completely beyond reach. Bayerlein watched as the first formations began to peel downward, lining up on the German positions around Saint-Lô. He had argued repeatedly that Allied air power, not ground tactics, would decide the battle. Now that truth roared toward him with the full weight of American industry. The ground trembled beneath his boots as the first bomb struck to the north. The sky flashed white, then orange, then black. The second wave came almost immediately after that, and the third after that, until the distinction between separate explosions disappeared into a continuous detonation that shook dust from the beams of the command post and sent shockwaves rippling through the earth like violent tides. Inside the dugout, men pressed headphones to their ears, shouting into radios that faintly crackled with static and panic. Lines went dead, reconnected, went dead again. Bayerlein tried reaching his forward companies, but most failed to answer. Those who did screamed to be heard over the bombardment. One commander yelled that entire hedgerows had been ripped from the ground like weeds. Another reported that tanks had been flipped or buried under dirt. A third didn't finish his sentence, only a burst of static remained. Outside, the world twisted into a wasteland of smoke and heaving soil. The American bombers had come not in dozens or hundreds, but over 1,000. Waves of B-17s, B-24s, and medium bombers timed to saturate every inch of Lehr's defensive line. The pressure in the air made men's ears ring and their chests vibrate. Explosions churned the earth into fountains that reached the height of houses. The hedgerows, once Panzer Lehr's grudging ally in defense, were shredded, flattened, vaporized. Vehicles disappeared under avalanches of dirt. Some tanks were thrown into trees or turned on their sides like overturned toys. Horses tore at their restraints in terror until blasts killed them outright. Bayerlein's adjutant tried to steady himself against a support beam when a shock wave punched through the dugout and knocked him to the floor. The general grabbed the man's arm and pulled him upright. They had no choice but to endure. Every instinct told Bayerlein to get above ground, to see the battlefield, to assess the damage, but stepping outside was impossible. The bombardment continued without pause. Even from underground, he felt the ground quivering like a living thing under a whip. One of the staff officers stumbled in with a bleeding forehead, shouting that some of their own troops were being hit by friendly German flak. Gunners in nearby batteries had panicked at the sight of the massive bomber streams and fired blindly upward. Bayerlein clenched his fist in frustration. Chaos bred mistakes, and this chaos was unlike anything he had experienced on the Eastern Front or in Africa. This was total saturation, the kind of annihilation that only an industrial power with endless factories could unleash. After nearly an hour, the intensity began to ease, but the damage was already carved into the landscape. Bayerlein ordered his men to gather reports immediately. Officers staggered out into a world that barely resembled the one they had inhabited that morning. Trees had been turned into jagged splinters, roads were gone, only raw trenches of torn earth remained. Tanks lay scattered at grotesque angles, some half-buried, some burning, others simply crushed beneath tons of displaced soil. The bodies of soldiers and horses were mixed with debris. Shocked survivors crawled from shell holes, coughing, bleeding, or wandering in dazed silence. More than one stared blankly at Bayerlein as he emerged, unable to understand or process what had happened. The general forced himself to move through the devastation. He needed to see it firsthand if he had any hope of reorganizing what remained of his division. The air was thick with smoke and dust, and the stench of burning fuel and shattered earth hung over everything. His boots sank deep into the churned soil. He examined a row of what had been armored vehicles only hours earlier. Several Panzer IVs and Panthers now lay twisted and useless, their crews either dead or scattered. Lehr had started the day with nearly 100 operational tanks. A quick count told Bayerlein that number was already gutted. But the Americans had not come merely to destroy Lehr from the air. The bombardment was preparation. Terrible, overwhelming preparation for the armored assault that followed. As the smoke cleared enough to reveal movement on the horizon, one of Bayerlein's officers shouted a warning. Through binoculars, Bayerlein saw them. Columns of American armor advancing, supported by infantry moving confidently across what had once been German defensive terrain. Sherman tanks, countless Shermans rolled forward unhindered. They did not need to fear hidden ambushes in the hedgerows anymore. The hedgerows themselves were gone. The land was leveled, opened, reshaped by the bombardment into a moonscape that favored movement over concealment. Lehr's surviving units tried to form a coherent line, but their positions were shattered and communications nearly non-existent. Orders traveled by runners, shouted commands, or sheer improvisation. A few resolute crews managed to get their Panthers and assault guns turned toward the enemy, firing from craters or behind ruined farm buildings. For brief moments, these isolated pockets fought with the skill expected of Panzer Lehr's veterans. They destroyed several advancing Shermans, forcing the Americans to proceed with caution. But each German tank was alone, unsupported, cut off. Inevitably, American air support returned to finish them, or massed armor surrounded them and destroyed them through superior numbers. Bayerlein tried to coordinate a counterattack using his last reserves, but the truth became undeniable. Lehr was no longer a cohesive fighting force.
It was fragments, courageous fragments, but fragments nonetheless. Hours later, as dusk approached and the American advance continued to widen the breach, Bayerlein stood atop the ruins of a collapsed farmhouse and surveyed what was left of his division. Smoke curled into the evening sky. The rumble of American armor drifted from beyond the next ridge. Lehr had been Germany's showpiece, its symbol of armored expertise, and in less than a day it had been battered almost beyond recognition. And the battle was far from over.
Through the fading light, Bayerlein could hear the distant clatter of engines, steady, organized, advancing with purpose. The Americans were exploiting the breach created by their bombardment, pushing deeper with every hour. Lehr, once the tight, well-drilled armored fist of the Western Front, had been reduced to a patchwork of scattered units struggling to regroup in a landscape that now felt alien. Yet even in its broken state, the division still carried the instinct to resist. Small knots of infantry moved through the ruins, gathering ammunition, dragging wounded comrades, and setting up hasty defensive lines wherever ground still offered the slightest advantage. Bayerlein made his way toward what remained of his forward command post. Along the path, he encountered a handful of surviving tank crews, suit-covered and exhausted, their uniforms torn and faces smeared with grime. One sergeant snapped to attention as the general approached, but Bayerlein motioned him to relax. The man described how his Panther had been thrown onto its side by a near miss, killing the loader instantly. The surviving crew had crawled out under machine gun fire and taken shelter in a crater until the shelling ceased. Now, without their vehicle, they were simply another refuge-seeking element of a division that had once defined mechanized warfare. At the shattered command post, corresponding messages from higher headquarters flickered through the static. General Hauser of the 7th Army demanded a report. Bayerlein had to choose his words carefully. He could not simply say his division had been pulverized, though that was the truth. Instead, he detailed the losses in calm, clipped phrases. Severe disruption of defensive positions, loss of communications, heavy casualties, catastrophic tank attrition. The numbers alone conveyed the scale of destruction. When he finished, a long pause followed. Then came the order to hold at all costs. Hold at all costs? Bayerlein stared at the receiver, incredulous. With what? He looked around at the chaos, maps torn from their pins, radios sputtering faint static, officers tending to wounded runners, the very ground trembling under the rumble of American artillery. Lehr was barely recognizable, but the order was absolute, and Bayerlein knew the weight of expectation placed on elite units. The prestige that had once empowered them now forced them to attempt the impossible. As the night deepened, Lehr's defenses stabilized into a broken but determined line. Survivors dug into shell holes or sheltered behind the ruins of farmhouses. They knew the Americans would not rush blindly into the dark. They would consolidate, reposition artillery, and prepare for a renewed assault at dawn. The German soldiers used the brief respite to organize their positions, redistribute ammunition, and examine what little armored support remained. A few Panzer IVs and Panthers had miraculously survived the bombardment. Mechanics worked frantically to coax damaged engines back to life, knowing every operational tank was worth its weight in gold. Throughout the night, Bayerlein walked the defensive line, speaking quietly to officers and enlisted men alike. His presence steadied them. He was known for leading from the front, and in this moment, his willingness to share their danger mattered as much as any tactical decision. He inspected a group of infantrymen manning an anti-tank gun salvaged from a collapsed emplacement. The barrel was intact, the shield was warped. The men promised they could still fire it. A short distance away, a squad of grenadiers crouched in the rubble of an orchard, watching flares arc over the horizon, illuminating the ragged contours of the battlefield. Just before dawn, the renewed American artillery preparation began. The shells came in measured, deliberate salvos, nothing like the cataclysmic bombardment of the day before, but powerful enough to soften the German line.
Bayerlein pressed his back against a half-demolished wall as the ground shook in steady pulses. After half an hour, the guns shifted further inland, signaling the start of the ground attack. Lehr's soldiers braced themselves. American infantry advanced first, moving cautiously through the ruins with rifles raised. Behind them came Sherman tanks, now maneuvering over terrain cleared by the bombardment. Bayerlein watched from a concealed vantage point as one of Lehr's surviving Panthers fired from hull-down position, knocking out a leading Sherman with a thunderous shot. Flames burst from the turret, forcing the crew to bail out. The Panther struck a second Sherman before an American tank destroyer returned fire and forced the crew to withdraw after a near hit shook the vehicle. Such isolated successes inspired brief hope, but Lehr's situation was untenable. The artillery had devastated the terrain so thoroughly that German defensive positions lacked depth. There was no second line to fall back to, no reserve battalion waiting to plug holes. Every man was already committed, and American material superiority showed in every direction. More tanks, more infantry, more artillery, more air support. German ammunition supplies dwindled by the hour, while the Americans seemed capable of replenishing everything overnight.
By mid-morning, American armor broke through a weak point in Lehr's center. Infantry units attempted to counterattack with small arms and Panzerfausts, but the Shermans pushed relentlessly forward, bypassing strong points and leaving them to the trailing infantry to reduce. The German defenders found themselves increasingly isolated, their fields of fire compromised by the churned-up terrain. Bayerlein ordered his few remaining vehicles to counter the breach, but coordinating them in the ruined landscape proved nearly impossible. Still, Lehr fought with the tenacity expected of its reputation. In one hedgerow-turned crater line, a machine gun team held up an entire American infantry company for nearly 20 minutes before being overwhelmed. In another sector, a lone assault gun blasted 3 Shermans from an improvised ambush before a P-47 Thunderbolt swooped in and destroyed it with rockets. Bayerlein received reports of armored grenadiers fighting hand-to-hand in a thicket that had survived the bombing. Each act of resistance slowed the American advance, but none could stop it. By early afternoon, it was clear that Lehr's front was collapsing. Bayerlein ordered a fighting withdrawal to positions further east. What remained of his division retreated under constant pressure, falling back through terrain that offered little concealment and no shelter from the Allied aircraft that roared overhead. Columns of dust betrayed every movement. American fighter bombers circled like hawks, diving repeatedly on any group of vehicles or infantry they spotted. Lehr's motorized advantage, once a defining feature, had evaporated. They moved slowly, cautiously, often on foot, lest engines give away their position. During one such withdrawal, Bayerlein's staff car was nearly destroyed when a P-47 strafed the road. The first burst shattered the windshield. The second tore into the embankment beside them. The driver swerved violently, plunging the vehicle into a ditch. Bayerlein and his adjutant crawled out, shaken but unharmed. The attack killed a group of grenadiers marching along the roadside. The general looked at the bodies and felt a heaviness that went beyond fatigue. This was no longer tactical warfare. This was survival against an opponent who controlled the sky, the supply lines, and the tempo of the battle. By evening of the second day of Operation Cobra, Lehr's strength had been further reduced. Reports indicated that only a handful of tanks remained operational, 7 by the most reliable count. The proud division that had once fielded some of the best armored vehicles in the Wehrmacht now had fewer tanks than an understrength company. Infantry losses were equally staggering. Communications were sporadic at best. Yet still, Bayerlein pushed his men to form new defensive lines, hoping to delay the American breakthrough long enough for other German units to react. That night, as darkness settled again over the churned plains of Normandy, Bayerlein gathered his remaining senior officers in a ruined barn lit by a single lantern. They spread out a map on a broken table, tracing the new front line with grim resignation. The Americans were widening the breach, pouring divisions into the gap with mechanical efficiency. Lehr could do little to stop them. The most they could hope for was to slow the advance,
buy time and preserve what few men remained. Outside, the night was punctuated by the distant sounds of engines and intermittent artillery flashes. Lehr's soldiers, fewer now and stretched thin across too wide a front, dug into whatever shelter they could find. Some collapsed into exhausted sleep, others cleaned their rifles, and still others stared out into the darkness, waiting for the next push. In the end, Bayerlein knew the truth. No amount of training, discipline, or tactical skill could overcome the overwhelming industrial power being applied against them. Lehr's fate was sealed the moment the American bombers appeared on the horizon. But the division was not finished yet. There was still ground to hold, still time to win for the collapsing German front, still pride left in the men who refused to break, even after enduring what no other division in France had faced. As the thin moon hung over the ruins, Bayerlein stepped outside, listening to the distant rumble of American armor preparing for another day's advance. He took a long breath, steadying himself. The third day would bring new trials, and whatever remained of Panzer Lehr would meet them as best it could.
Dawn on the third day arrived muted and gray, as if the sky itself hesitated to reveal the full extent of the battlefield below. A thin mist settled along the low ground, clinging to broken trees and crater-littered fields. Bayerlein scarcely slept. He had spent the night moving from position to position, absorbing every detail of his division's condition. 7 tanks left. 7. Scattered infantry groups. Ammunition stocks dwindling. Communications patchy. The division that had once been the pride of the armored schools now resembled a wounded animal limping from one defensive stance to another. He stood on a shallow rise, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the horizon where distant engine noises steadily grew louder. The Americans were on the move again. More armor, more infantry, more trucks carrying supplies to feed what seemed like an unstoppable tide. This was not a probing attack. This was a rolling, continuous offensive aimed at breaking Germany's entire western line. Lehr happened to stand in the path of the main thrust. As the mist lifted, more of the devastation became visible. Smoke still drifted from shattered farmhouses. Burned-out vehicles dotted the fields like charred skeletons. Craters overlapped one another so thoroughly that the terrain looked molten, as if a giant hand had kneaded the earth into unnatural shapes. Here and there, German soldiers were emerging from makeshift shelters, rubbing their eyes, adjusting helmets, preparing for yet another day that none believed would end in victory. Shortly after sunrise, American artillery began once more. But this bombardment was controlled, targeted, far less apocalyptic than the first day, yet still enough to shatter weakened nerves and force troops deeper into whatever shelter they could find. The shells walked across the German positions with mechanical precision. Bayerlein found himself counting seconds between salvos, noticing the rhythm, the tempo. The Americans were coordinating fire with advancing units. He could hear engines growing louder in concert with the artillery's creeping barrage. By the time the shelling shifted, Shermans were already pushing forward. Bayerlein signaled for his remaining armor to counter the advance. The surviving tanks, an exhausted mix of Panthers and Panzer IVs, crept into forward positions. There was a strange, almost ceremonial dignity to their movement, as if the crews understood they were driving not merely towards battle, but towards the final chapter of their division's legacy. A Panther fired the first shot of the day, destroying a Sherman at nearly 1,000 meters. The explosion briefly lifted German morale, and the crew repositioned immediately, trying to avoid return fire. Another German tank knocked out an American half-track, sending infantry scrambling for cover. For a moment, the front flickered with the energy of a division that refused to die quietly. But the Americans responded with speed and coordination that Lehr could no longer match. Tank destroyers maneuvered into flanking positions.
Artillery called in from rear units pounded German firing points with terrifying accuracy. And once again, the ubiquitous P-47 Thunderbolts swooped overhead, dropping bombs and firing rockets on any vehicle that dared to move. One of Lehr's Panthers was hit directly by a pair of rockets, erupting into flames and forcing the crew to bail out into a hail of machine gun fire. By late morning, American infantry had infiltrated deep into Lehr's weakened center. Bayerlein knew he needed to prevent a rout. He moved forward with a handful of staff officers to rally a group of grenadiers who were falling back too quickly. Amid the smoke and confusion, he stood exposed for several minutes, shouting orders, pointing to defensible ridges, urging the men to hold their ground. Several soldiers later remarked how surreal it seemed to see their general in the middle of the battlefield, his uniform smeared with dirt, helmet askew, face set in grim determination. But even leadership could not alter the material reality of Lehr's infantry line, buckling under the weight of the American advance. More units began withdrawing, some in good order, others disorganized. Bayerlein reluctantly ordered another fallback, this time towards a line of low hills that offered a modest defensive advantage. The move had to be executed quickly before the Americans could envelop them. The withdrawal was chaos. With few functioning vehicles left, many soldiers traveled on foot, carrying wounded comrades on improvised stretchers. The roads were clogged with rubble and wrecks. Those tanks that still ran crawled forward cautiously, each movement risking detection by enemy aircraft. Several times, American fighter bombers appeared overhead, forcing crews to abandon their vehicles temporarily until the threat passed. Still, Lehr managed to reform a defensive line by midday. Bayerlein personally inspected the positions, encouraging the men who had reached the ridge. Their faces were drawn, hollowed by exhaustion and shock. Some had not eaten since the start of the operation, others had lost track of the day. And yet, when they saw their general, they straightened their posture, gripping rifles more tightly, ready to continue.
The Americans struck again in the early afternoon. Their artillery opened with another concentrated barrage, targeting the newly formed line. Lehr's defenders clung to the ridge, ducking behind rocks or into shallow trenches scraped from the earth. Then the tanks came, Shermans in long, sweeping lines, advancing with the confidence of a force that had already broken the back of German resistance. Behind them came infantry, fresh and supplied, moving with coordinated precision. The first Shermans to reach the ridge attempted to climb its slope. Here, for a brief moment, Lehr's remaining anti-tank weapons sprung into action. A hidden Pak-40 fired point-blank at a tank cresting the rise, blowing the turret off in a blast that echoed down the hillside. Another American tank was hit by a Panzerfaust team who had crawled forward under fire to find a firing angle. For several minutes, the ridgeline erupted in smoke and flame as German defenders held off the leading American elements. But Lehr lacked depth. Every weapon that fired became a target, and soon shells began landing directly on the crest. The Pak-40 was destroyed by a Sherman's return fire. The Panzerfaust team was pinned down by machine gun bursts. A few remaining German tanks attempted to counterattack, but were quickly overwhelmed by American numbers and air support. A P-47 spotted two of Lehr's tanks as they maneuvered behind the ridge and obliterated them with bombs. Another German tank was taken out by ground fire when its engine failed at the worst possible moment, leaving it immobile on the slope. By late afternoon, the ridge was no longer tenable. American infantry had infiltrated both flanks. Bayerlein again ordered a withdrawal, but this time he knew it would be the last organized pullback his division could manage. Lehr was spent. Whatever cohesion it still possessed was held together only by the grit of its surviving officers and the instinct of its soldiers to stay alive. As the remnants of the division retreated eastward, the battlefield behind them dissolved into a scene of total conquest.
American armor rolled across the ridge, infantry fanned out to secure the area, and artillery moved forward to prepare for the next phase of the offensive. Operation Cobra had achieved its aim. The German line in Normandy was broken, and Allied forces now flowed through the breach like water through a shattered dam. That night, Bayerlein finally received permission from higher command to disengage. The order came too late to save Lehr's equipment, but it allowed the battered survivors to avoid complete encirclement. In small groups, often traveling under cover of darkness or through wooded paths, the remnants of Panzer Lehr withdrew toward new defensive positions far to the east. Some soldiers did not make it. Others became separated and rejoined days later, but many survived. Men who would later describe the opening of Operation Cobra as the most devastating single event they had experienced in the entire war. When dawn rose on July 29th, 4 days after the first bomb fell, the Panzer Lehr Division no longer existed in any meaningful tactical sense. It had been gutted, reduced from 93 tanks to 7, from elite mechanized strength to a scattering of exhausted infantry. Its vehicles were wrecked across miles of ruined countryside. Its command structure was barely functional, and its general, Fritz Bayerlein, carried the heavy knowledge that even the finest German training and battlefield skill could not withstand the sheer industrial might unleashed against them. Bayerlein stood beside a roadside ditch, watching the remnants of his division march past. Some limped on wounded legs, some used ammunition crates as splints. A few carried comrades who were too injured to walk. They looked nothing like the polished, confident Lehr troops who had arrived in Normandy weeks earlier. Yet in their faces he saw something unbroken, not hope for victory. Such illusions had evaporated, but a determination to endure, to do their duty as long as they could, even as the war turned inexorably against them. He saluted them silently, knowing what they had endured, knowing what they had lost. Operation Cobra would be remembered as the moment Allied power cracked open the German front in the West. But for the men of Panzer Lehr, it was the moment when the reality of industrial warfare overwhelmed even the most skilled defenders. The battle did not end with a dramatic charge or a decisive duel of tanks. It ended with the grinding realization that courage and expertise could not match an enemy whose factories, skies, and logistics worked with machine-like precision. As the column of survivors continued down the road, Bayerlein turned away from the ruined fields of Normandy. The battle was over, but its lessons and its scars would stay with him long after the echoes of American artillery faded from the hills.